You're listening to WBAR, WBAR, Barnard College Radio, freeform radio here at Barnard College. My name is Dino, your host for dun 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 Ovation, the performing arts show. Basically, here for Ovation, we focus on different artists, comedians, singers, dancers, actors, puppeteers, even if we can find them. I do have a friend that's a puppeteer, but she's in Finland. Maybe she can send a puppet on her behalf to New York City. We'll see. Today we're featuring the great, the wonderful, the fabulous. More adjectives?
No, I think that'll do.
That's plenty of adjectives, Dino. Christine Gentry. Let me read. She's a storyteller, and let me do a little bit of a bio on her. This is my reading voice. Christine Gentry joins barbecue on the short list of good things to come out of Texas. A high school English teacher at heart, she is currently a PhD student and adjunct instructor at Columbia University. She is grateful to Student Press Initiative and The Moth for allowing her to avoid teenager withdrawal by letting her teach creative writing and oral storytelling to NYC public school students. In what little spare time she has, Christine likes to write short stories and perform at oral storytelling shows around the city. Her work has been published in Word Riot, Flashquake, and Printer's Devil Review magazines, and her oral stories have been featured on the Story Collider, Risk, and This American Life podcasts. She is currently working on a memoir project about her family. Let's put our hands together. Our WBAR Ovation hands together for Christine Gentry. Are you doing jazz? So Christine, welcome. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling well. It's almost getting warm. I'm excited about that.
It has been a long, cold winter.
So long, so cold.
So Christine, can you tell us a little bit about your growing up? Where did you grow up?
I grew up on the poor side of a really large suburb of Dallas in Texas, as you might know.
And so would you say that you were actually living in Dallas, or was it in this small place?
It was, it's technically a suburb of Dallas, but it was actually pretty huge. It's called Garland, and technically it's the 10th largest city in Texas. But
Wow.
We had like 5 or 6 high schools, so it was a big place, but it wasn't a city to itself. Probably it was considered a suburb of Dallas.
Cool. So when we were talking at the beginning, the first part of your bio was Christine joins barbecue on the short list of good things to come out of Texas. And I was talking to you beforehand at it because I don't like to poke where poking's not permitted or liked. Did you find there were at all any problems growing up in Texas that you found?
Sure. I think at the time when I was little, I didn't really know that they were problems. It's something you figure out when you get older. I think, that's mostly a joke, what I say in my bio, but I've also figured out through living in Boston for 6 years and now New York in 4, that some of my favorite people here are the people who are from the South, but happy here. Do you know what I mean? So they keep the great things about the South, like the friendliness and the storytelling, but they a little less of the racism, a little less of the kind of closed-minded exclusivism, a little less of the aggressive religion, things like that.
And do you think those things that the negatives, do you think those are part of the small town experience? Do you think it's something more?
I don't know if I could count myself as a small town girl though, because Garland was so big. I don't think that counts. And to be fair, it's not like Texas, everyone there is racist and everyone there is religious. It's not like that at all. It's just that behaviors like that, so like closed-minded exclusivist religion and some racist behaviors are generally more accepted, I guess I would say, down there.
So when you grew up, what did your parents do?
My dad was a mechanic and my mom was a housewife, so we were very poor. I have 2 brothers, so at one point there were 5 of us in a 2-bedroom house. My dad renovated the garage into another bedroom for me, so I didn't have to sleep with my brothers.
Wow. And how would you describe your relationship with all of your family members, your parents and your brothers?
That is a very complicated question. I think
we have a lot of time.
Yeah, we do. Have you read about Andrew Solomon's relatively recent book? It's called Far from the Tree.
I'm planning on this show ends at 12 already. I'll
You'll
start reading
read it
at
at
12:01. That's my plan.
It's a great book. It's a tome, to warn listeners. It's very long, but it's awesome. He has this theory about, he calls vertically aligned children versus horizontally aligned children, and he says like vertically aligned children are the ones who are just like their parents, who love everything their parents love and end up being like mini-me's of the parents, and then horizontally aligned would be people who are not, you know. So he interviewed families where the kid was, you know, deaf or gay or something like that. I'm not gonna say that I'm like that different from my family, but I am so different from my family in almost every way. Like, I'm the only person in my family to go to college. I'm the only person on either side of my family, as far as I've ever looked, to go to a grad school program, at least at the doctorate level. And so, you know, my dad is ex-military Vietnam vet, and my brothers are both Marines. My mother's dad was in the Marines. All of my dad's brothers were in different branches of the military. So, like, I'm from a military, working class, Republican family.
And you had the two brothers. How was it being the sole girl of the children?
I didn't really feel it, you know. I think it's because I was very boyish, you know. Like, growing up with my two brothers, I think, is an explanation of why I go paintballing for my birthday every year and why I never get manicures and don't really enjoy shopping and stuff like that. I just was never socialized like a girl. I grew up with my brothers playing outside and doing boy stuff, and so it was fun. I never felt like really left out for gender-wise.
And these things are hard to unpack because of the time, how long ago they were. Do you think you're naturally more boyish, or do you think it was because of your brother's influence and the highly military sort of background? The nature-nurture question, as they say.
I mean, there's no control me, right? That we can go back and observe, having grown up with sisters, what I would be like. I do credit my brothers with a lot of my more typically considered male characteristics, but I also don't know how much of that is natural. I do think that there's like a call to nature inside of me, and that's not necessarily masculine. You know, lots of girls like the outdoors, but you know, girls are socialized, and this is a long conversation, but I feel like girls are socialized to be more like prim and proper and nice and clean. And so a lot of times they'll grow up and not enjoy things like camping or hiking or mud wrestling or what have you. And I love all those things.
Okay, and was your mother kind of slightly more boyish? And if not, was there any tension between you and her saying, "Oh, no, Christine, be more prim"?
No, not at all. I think it's funny because my mom grew up with all sisters and my dad grew up with all brothers. But I don't think that my mom never discouraged me from playing with the boys. And she's certainly not prim and proper. Like, she can curse with the best of them. But no, I don't think we ever clashed about that, about me being boyish. No.
Okay, you talked about you like being outdoors and you have an outdoor vibe. Garland being so close to Dallas.
Yeah.
Dallas is a major city. Was there a lot of outdoors where you grew up?
My family went camping because we were so poor we couldn't afford actual vacations. You know what I mean? Like, the first time I got on a plane, I was 19 years old.
And that was by mistake.
That was it. That was like, what am I doing here?
I'm a stowaway.
But, you know, anytime my dad had time off or we had time off of school, we were always in the woods. We'd go to Tyler State Park or Texoma, something like that, and just spend a week, like, in the woods together as a family.
And that was during the summer or throughout the year?
Oh, you know, it never gets really cold in Texas. But it's usually, I mean, summer vacations or spring break, things like that.
Oh, that's nice.
Thanks. I thought it was nice, too.
Okay, so obviously you're studying English.
Right. Yeah, right now?
Yeah. So did you have did you notice even as a child that you had not even just an outdoor bent, but also an artistic bent to you?
I think I found out really young that I was into school and learning. I often joke around with people that my childhood was like Roald Dahl's Matilda. Do you know that book?
I'm reading that right after the Solomon book.
Shut up! Where my family...
I work in radio. We unless I've heard it. We just hear it. Unless I heard it, I haven't. Go ahead.
Well, most people have at least heard what the book is about, right? It's about this nerdy little girl and her family is like...
I'm being profiled.
A little bit. Anyway, I'm just telling you that my family loves like football and TV. Nobody reads. And so like when I was a child... like a typical Monday night, it would be my parents and my brothers watching TV, and I'm in the hallway just devouring a bookshelf that was filled with this motley collection of books. And my mom was a volunteer at the church library, and so we couldn't afford to buy books, so she would bring home whatever books the library was getting rid of. So we had this bookshelf filled with like outdated science books or like old mystery novels that no one was checking out, or like cat books or something like that, right? So, but I read them all. I was obsessed, you know. And I remember distinctly one afternoon when my family was watching something, probably football, and I just walked out of the house. I was like 8, and I walked to the public library, which is, you know, half a mile away, something like that. And I grabbed David Attenborough's autobiography, and I sat there and read the whole thing, like cover to cover, in the library.
So, did you find, because of the humble beginnings, that you didn't have books around the house? Did you find that your mom bringing these back, were they kind of like some kind of spirited in possession that you found that like you kind of fetishized to some extent? Or was your reading, again, was it based on maybe the rest of your family not being as intellectually curious as you? What do you think the motivation for you in reading?
Well, you're also asking an English teacher what the draw of books are, which is like, books are magical. Yeah. Like, they're just amazing, and I figured that out very young, and was drawn to them very young. And, you know, when I went to school, my parents just sent me to the elementary school across the street, which makes sense. In kindergarten was a half day of apple juice and nap time, and they didn't figure out when I was in kindergarten that I already knew how to read. So it wasn't until I was in first grade that my teacher knew immediately. And she calls this parent-teacher conference. She's like, Christina already knows how to read.
She's a reader.
We spend the vast majority of the time here in first grade, like, teaching kids how to read. She's going to be so bored. She needs to skip at least 1 grade, maybe 2. And my parents are like, absolutely not.
And why was that?
Because she's already weird. She's already little. She's going to get picked on. You're going to send her up to another grade with the bigger kids. She's going to stay with kids her own age. And my teacher was like, okay. And she secretly sent me up to the 2nd grade. So my mom would walk me across the street, drop me off in Miss Kid's room, and Miss Kid would wait for her to leave, and then she would say, okay, Christine, you know where to go. And I would go to 2nd grade.
Did your parents ever find out?
Yeah, so she, again, I wish I could find this woman, because I have to credit her with almost everything that's happened with me, education-wise, but
she's writing your dissertation for you.
Well, she's responsible for the beginning, we'll say that. She figured out that the district offered this test to get you into the academy, is what it was called. It was like still a free public school, but it was a magnet school. And so she arranged for me to take the test, and then when I did well on it, she called another parent-teacher conference and came clean with my parents. She's like, I've been sending Christina to the 2nd grade, but I had her take this test, and she did really well. She has to go to this school.
And I had her wear stilts, so she seemed as tall, if not taller than the others. And the academy was, okay, so you got switched by your teacher at what grade?
I was in first when I took the test, and then I started Kimberlin Academy at 2nd grade.
And this is the academy you're talking about. And could you describe the difference between the original school and the academy? In terms of, you know, the structure of the building, the teachers, everything else?
The building was prettier, but I'm not sure if that has... I'm not sure if that has much to do with how important it was for me, the change. I think it was more just that she was right. Miss Kid was right. First grade at that first school was teaching kids how to read, and I already knew how to do it. So by the time I got to 2nd grade, it was exciting to be challenged in school. And you know, I have a lot of, as an educator now, I have a lot of feelings about tracking, negative feelings. But in the district that I was in, we had a really strictly tracked school system. So once I was put into the academy, it was basically decided. You know, like, I stayed in the academy through elementary school, went to another academy for middle school, full international baccalaureate diploma in high school. It was basically decided that I was going to go to college and continue doing that. Whereas my brothers, right, because my parents wanted them to go to the same school as I did. So now that they knew about this test, they had my brother sit down and take it. And it was just, they didn't do well on it. And it was, you know, it's an arbitrary, stupid test. At the age of 8, you decide, you know, how quote-unquote smart a kid is. And so they're put in the lowest track. They stay in the elementary school across the street. They're never really challenged in school. They hate it. They graduate with almost worthless diplomas, and then they both join the Marines. Shocker.
Was there any tension you found after you went to the academy between you and your siblings?
I don't think so. I think my brothers have always been like, they love me, but they've always been like, she's weird. She's a weird one.
She's a weirdo.
She's a weird one. She's got her nose in the books. Whatever. You know? There was never any negative tension between us. It was just, from a very young age, I knew that school was my thing. and that my teachers and my classmates are going to be my support group for that, not my family.
And when did you you were saying that you kind of knew relatively early on that you were gonna go to college? Was it shortly after you went to the academy? Like you went, I'm on this track, I'm gonna succeed here.
I honestly can't remember the first time I thought about college. It was just a given, you know. From my teachers in second grade on, they were just like, yeah, you guys are the smart ones. You're going to college. You're gonna do well. You know, it was just, you know, those really crappy social experiments they did back before it was wrong or illegal. Not before it was wrong, before it was illegal. Yes, exactly. Where you split kids up and you're like, you're the smart group, you're the dumb group, and they would meet you there, right? And the expectations you had for them. And that's part of why I think tracking is messed up. Did
you have any inclination towards the arts? Like, because again, you sounded like you're a big reader, but were you on the creative part of it, like making your own or consuming stories?
Yeah, of course. I wrote these nerdy little books. I should have brought one for you today. Actually, I read it. Do you know the show Mortified?
I've heard of it.
Oh, it's great. So people get up and they read something, you know, embarrassing that they wrote when they were kids. And I performed in that show a couple months ago, and I read this book called Sometimes How It Feels, Help for Frustrated Kids with Ugly Brothers and Sisters. It was something I'd written when I was like 7 or 8. So yeah, I would make these stupid little books, and I would find paper and fold them in half and staple them and make books. I have a few of those still, but I made a lot of them. So yeah, I started creative writing, I guess, when I was very young. But I was a pretty shy kid until probably late middle school.
And did you find, given your shyness, that the writing was a way for you to express yourself, but in a more of a sort of a mediated, kind of personal, non-out-there way?
Oh, sure. It's safer. Yeah. It's not like I was sharing these books with anybody. They were just my thing. Maybe I'd share them with my best friend, you know?
Awesome. Is there anything you want to talk about before? Because we have a story that we have about... Oh, yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about... Okay, so we have a story that we're going to play very shortly, and it deals with...
My dad.
Your dad. So do you want to talk about a little bit about, because we've been talking about your childhood, do you want to talk a little bit about your father in a way to set this up or in any kind of way? Like, again, not too much. Like, I don't want to overlap with the story.
I think the story does a really good job of giving you a snapshot of my dad, actually. So I don't want to say too much about him, but I will give you a little background on the story itself. This story was recorded for a live show that a wonderful... podcast is called The Story Collider. They have a live show in a regular live show in New York and also Boston, and their kind of thing is that you tell stories about science and how it's affected your lives. And so they asked me to tell a story at the show that's themed about animals, and I was like, oh man, I love animals. I've owned so many of them my whole life, and I was like, actually, you know, all good stories are about relationships, right? So like, what relationship can be best illuminated through the animals that have come in and out of my life? And it's like, oh, it's my dad. It's got to be my dad, right? So then I crafted this story around the lessons that he's taught me through the animals that have come in and out of our lives. So.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to be listening to a story by Christine Gentry on The Story Collider. Let's hope this plays properly.
Everyone, I'm Ben Lilly, and welcome to The Story Collider, where we bring you true stories of how science has affected people's lives. This is podcast number 120. I'll stop doing the numbers next week, but I like 101. It's a good number. This week's storyteller is Christine Gentry. The story was recorded in September 2012 at Union Hall in Brooklyn. The theme of the event was animals.
So my dad is only 5 feet 9 inches tall, but he's probably one of the most intimidating men on the planet. He's one of those ex-Air Force Vietnam vets who never talks about what it was like in the shit and rarely talks about what it was like anywhere else. He's not real good on the processing of feelings, but he's fascinated by animals. And I've come to realize that a lot of what I know about him and myself and the natural world has come from the animals that have come in and out of our lives. So lesson number 1. Don't give a rat's ankle what other people think of you. We grew up on the poor side of a large suburb in Texas, and most of the houses in the neighborhood where I lived in did not have fenced yards, front or back. And because we were so poor, most of the meat that we ate came from animals that my father had killed. So it was a regular vision for my father to bring home a deer and string it up by its hind legs in our Chinaberry tree and gut it and butcher it in front of the entire neighborhood. And this was like my first dissection. It wasn't weird to me. It was just parts of animals and how they worked. And my dad would call me over and show me all the different parts. And it was totally normal for my mom to tell me to call my dad in for dinner and for me to go out into the backyard and see him running a deer head through a table saw because he wanted to keep the antlers for the living room wall. And whenever a mother would pass by and shield her child's eyes from the gore, he would say, "Let him look." We're at elementary school show and tell. My father encouraged me to bring a black widow that we had caught on a camping trip and kept in a jar. I was pumped about this. I couldn't wait. I was going to show my elementary school classmates all the desiccated cricket bodies at the bottom of the jar and how cool it was that she killed them. And I was very disappointed to report to my father at dinner that night that most of my classmates started crying when I pulled out the black widow. And he goes, don't worry about them. They're being a bunch of babies. A few days later, I woke up to find that this black widow had laid an egg sack, and it was beautiful. It was laid in a hammock of silk attached to the lid of this jar. And when my dad got home from work, I called him in to show him the egg sack. And I was like, "Can we keep it, please?" Because in my mind, like the fantasy of some Charlotte's Web, like little baby spider swinging from silk and saying like, "Good morning, Christine. Good morning." And my dad was like, "Now listen, the last thing we need is a house full of widows." And we had punched air holes in the top of the jar. And he was like, "Ain't nothing can be done. We gotta take it out." So in a like ceremonial, beautiful gesture, we opened the jar and laid it at the foot of a yucca plant in my suburban neighborhood, where black widows then roamed free. Lesson number 2. Ain't no use crying about things you can't do nothing about. One of my earliest memories is a fishing trip to my grandparents' house in Gun Barrel City, Texas. And it exists. Look it up. And they lived on a lake, and we were fishing, and I was with my granddad at the bottom of the dock, and he caught a fish and pulled it up, and when it landed on the dock, it was flapping and gasping and very disturbing for me as a child. So I turned around and ran to my dad, and I bear hugged his legs. The problem was that my dad was standing with my uncle with a fishing pole like this, and the hook laid right where my eye was. So I ran up and bear hugged him, and that hook went straight into my eye. And, of course, I start screaming, and my dad kneels and calm down. And he takes my chin, he moves it this way and that to get a good look at the hook, and it hadn't gone in far enough. It hadn't gone into the barb. So he just plucks it out, grabs me, holds me up, and says, "Jan, take this one to the house and put some sporin in her eye. She's gonna be fine." My 3rd grade science teacher had gerbils, and everybody knew that one lucky 3rd grader every summer got to keep the gerbils all summer long. And I lobbied all year. I was going to be that 3rd grader. And I won, and in the summer, she was like, "Christine, you get to take my gerbils." And I was so pumped. But the only place that we could keep gerbils was in an aquarium on top of the microwave, which is on top of a rolling kind of container, which was in the dining room. So in order for me, a tiny little 3rd grader, to take care of the gerbils, I had to climb on a chair and climb on the dining room table and reach over into the aquarium to change their water or their food or whatnot. And as gerbils are wont to do, they replicated while under my care. And one of the babies was immediately my favorite. I named it Sparky. Had a little white spot in its forehead. And one Sunday morning, I crawled up on the chair and crawled up on the dining room table and reached into the aquarium and scooped up Sparky. And I held him in my palm and I was like, "Sparky, you're the best. You're the best." And I was talking to him, and he got scared by something. And he goes, "Eep," and jumped out of my hand. Now, I watched this baby gerbil in slow-mo fall the entire length of my body and the entire length of the dining room table and slam onto the linoleum floor. I scream. I scramble off the table. I go down, I scoop him up, and I hold him up to my face, and I hear him go, clearly not okay. So my shrieking calls my father into the dining room, and I just blubber something about Sparky, Sparky, foul, Sparky, foul. And my dad leans down, takes a good look at him, listens, grabs him by the tail and says, ain't nothing can be done, and walks through the house with me crawling after him like, what? What are you doing? What are you doing, Sparky? And he gets to the bathroom, and he closes the door, and I hear whoosh. And the door opens, and I'm like, Sparky? And he goes, we're late to church. Go on and get in the car. On a middle school camping trip, I caught an anole, and I don't know if you know what these are. They're amazing. They're like the poor man's chameleon. They're cute little dudes. They're like this long and green with white bellies, and they could turn green or brown depending on what they're on. And of course, this was like long before I worked at a zoo. I had no idea how to sex a lizard. He looked like a boy to me, so I named him Charlie. And I set him up in an aquarium, a terrarium, excuse me. I got potting soil, I filled it, I put plants in there, I would spray the plants with water so you could lap it up, and I dug crickets up in the alley, and I loved this lizard. And one morning I woke up, and there was a little egg, and I was sitting in the potting soil, and I couldn't wait till my dad got home from work. I was going to show him. I got home, I was like, Dad, look at that, an egg! Charlie laid an egg! And he reached into the aquarium and goes, that ain't an egg, Christine! He pulled it up. He's like, this is just a piece of potting soil styrofoam. Yolk. Started dripping down his fingers. And he went, oh, that's weird. Guess we're gonna start calling Charlena. And walked out of my room. Lesson number 3, dads don't know everything. On another camping trip, this time in high school, there was one of those thunderstorms that only Texas can do, like apocalyptic, huge thunderstorm. And my dad wakes me and my brothers up very early. The sun wasn't, like, barely up. I was like, I'm gonna show you something. Put on your rain boots. Put on our rain boots. Nice. We go walking through the flooded grassland, and we come upon this gorgeous dome. And it was this burnt orange color. And as we get closer to it, I realize that it's ants. It's ants. It's an entire dome of ants. Fire ants have this amazing adaptation. When their colony is flooded, they gang together and create a living raft of fire ants. They sacrifice the bottom level for the good of the colony. And I'm fascinated by this, and I'm leaning forward and watching them crawl all over each other. And my dad says, back up. And he sprays the entire dome with off and throws a match. And it lights into this macabre lantern, and he pushes it off into the water. My brother's like, cool! I'm like, Dad, what? And he goes off to do something, and I start searching for other domes because the fire ants are everywhere in Texas. And when I find one, I call my brothers over and don't touch it. I go up to it, and I show them how if you take 2 sticks and you stick them into the center of the dome and slowly pull them apart, you can get an amazing view of the grubs. And if you're really lucky, you can see the queen, and how much cooler that is and way more humane. When I was 8 years old, my mother sent me into the backyard to get some ice cream for our guests. And since we were poor, we would buy those big buckets of ice cream, cheap ice cream from Sam's Club, and we kept them in a freezer, a large freezer in the shed. And I tromp through the backyard, and I open the shed, and I get to the freezer, and I shove it open, and I pull myself over the freezer, and I scream. Because inside of the freezer is a bobcat. And it's hugging the ice cream like this and looking up at me with a bullet hole right in the middle of its forehead. And I go back I'm like, where's Dad? Mom goes, he's at work, he'll be back in a couple hours. And I sit on that couch and I wait. And when Dad gets home, I stomp my little 8-year-old foot and I said, Daddy, why is there a bobcat in the freezer? And he said, because it was there and I wanted to show my friends. I was like, Dad, you will not kill anything that ain't bothering you and that you ain't gonna eat. And he looks at his little 8-year-old daughter for a good 5 seconds. And goes, all right. Shakes on it. And to this day, that man has not killed anything that ain't bothering him and that he ain't gonna eat. Lesson number 4. Dads get softer as they get older. My parents moved to rural Maryland my senior year of undergrad, and my first visit home was pretty incredible. My parents moved to my dad's parents' house and kind of took it over, and so there's so many memories there. And the first thing we did is after dinner, my dad said, come take a walk with me. And I did, and we walked across the property, which is 11 acres of gorgeous land, and we turned the corner out to the barn, and there was this pond. It was never there before. My dad had dug out a natural spring and created a pond and planted water lilies and filled it with goldfish, and there was a bench. And we sat on the bench, and I was speechless, and we watched the sunset. And I heard this, and
Every time I'm gonna show it, something's coming up.
It's
Like it's like this. It's this.
And I said, oh yeah, it's Frank. He comes around every now and then and says hello. And I'm like, who is this man? And what has he done with my father? And thank you. A couple years ago, my dad lost his last dog. We had dogs my whole life. This is not the only dog that my dad has lost. And he took it so hard. He was so heartbroken that my neighbor heard him wailing through closed windows and had to come help him dig the grave. And this is a man I saw cry 3 times my whole life. My dad is 63 years old, and he'll still kill a groundhog with 1 shot if it gets anywhere near his garden. And he'll kill a cat. The cat is fair game if it's in the trash bins. But it does get 1 free pass if it has a collar. But the last time I was home, I watched this man curl up on the floor with his new 8-pound miniature dachshund on her little dog bed and play fight with her in what can only be described as baby voice. Are you in my bed? Are you in my bed? And I realized in this overwhelming moment of simultaneous beauty and real horror, like how very devastated I'm gonna be when I lose him. And how much of me, the good, the bad, the smart, the stubborn, the strong, and the very scared, is really just him, curled up inside of me.
You're listening to WBAR, WBAR, Barnard College Freeform Radio here at, you guessed it, Barnard College. My name is Dino, your host for Ovation, the performing arts show. Again, we feature puppeteers?
That's
Exclusive, only puppeteers. It's a puppeteer-friendly space.
not this week.
Musicians, and this week, storytellers with our good friend, Ms. Christine Gentry. So in last segment, we were talking a little bit about Christine's childhood, and we stopped it a little bit early. We only went to the elementary school part. So Christine, tell us a little bit about your transition to high school.
I transitioned into high school through the middle school, which was also an academy. It was called Austin Academy. And middle school is actually where I got interested in theater. I had a theater class and loved it. So I guess I would say I started to transition from like really shy, kind of internal girl to more external and enjoying performance, probably in like 8th grade. I had an amazing English teacher also in 8th grade who let us do one project kind of in any form we wanted, and I ended up doing a group musical with a group of friends of mine, and we took like Disney songs and changed the lyrics to apply to the books that we read, and it's one of my favorite memories of school. And I think by the time I got to 9th grade, I knew that I was interested in theater for sure. So I started taking theater right away, and I also joined the speech and debate team that Garland High School had. And so I started going to all the regional competitions for that, and would do like prose reading and poetry reading, and also something called HI and DI, which is humorous interpretation and dramatic interpretation, which is where you kind of perform. It's like a monologue. And did well there and enjoyed it very much. So by the time I was a senior in high school, I considered myself a performer and actually directed a play through International Baccalaureate's theater program. It was my elective in my IB diploma.
So would you say that during middle school and high school, the little turtle came out of her little shell? Did she?
Yes. And considering I currently own a tortoise, I think that's a nice metaphor. A tortoise came out of her shell.
Don't worry, I've done the research. I know.
Oh, you
know?
know?
I know.
Nice.
Could you talk about did you have a strong bond with the people on your debating, performing circuit?
I think anytime you like hang out with someone a lot outside of school, and you're like going to these conferences and staying in hotel rooms together and things, like you become close friends. But I can't say I'm actually still in touch with anyone from that scene, at least not in middle school. When I was a senior in high school, my theater teacher actually encouraged me to apply to Juilliard and do theater, more seriously, and I was too terrified to put all of my eggs in the performance basket. So when I went to college, I decided to just totally press the pause button completely on theater and performance, and get a degree to fall back on like a real grown up.
Okay, and you were terrified because did you think that path didn't have a business career aspect to it? Were you just maybe afraid to perform at a higher level?
I just heard a lot of stories about people who don't have backup plans and throw themselves into it and end up, career waitresses with no real other option if acting doesn't work out for them, And in my mind, I thought, well, I'll always have acting. I can always go back and do it, but at least now I'll also have a degree that has nothing to do with it. You know what I mean? So I refused, even though I wanted to, I refused to take part in Baylor's theater department. I didn't take any theater classes. I did a totally academic degree.
And it was called?
Oh, I got a Bachelor of Arts, but I didn't really have a major. I got into a program called the University Scholars Program, and it's a really fancy word for undecided. So you get to spend the entire 4 years basically taking whatever classes you want. You have to get them approved through your advisor, but through that program I got to skip all the basics or the boring classes I didn't want to take, and I got to take all the 4,000 level classes and things I was actually interested in.
Were there any negatives to having all that freedom?
No, absolutely not. I feel like I'm not even confident that I could say I would have enjoyed Baylor otherwise. But I had such a wonderful experience in undergrad because every class I took was something I wanted to take and that I enjoyed taking.
Okay, and it's based in Waco?
It is.
What's how's the vibe there? And again, there's an interesting past to that area of Texas.
It's funny, everybody always thinks of David Koresh, but that actually wasn't even in Waco. I think it was like 15 or 20 miles outside. It was just Waco was the closest city, so they said that it was in Waco. It was obviously much smaller than Dallas, but I think it was good for me in those 4 years of my life. It's like a nice stepping stone to something bigger like Boston, which is where I ended up after undergrad. And I found a nice group of people there, like joined a band and, put out a CD and, the stuff that you do in college when you have a nice, tight-knit group of artsy friends.
I just knitted. I didn't put out a CD. It's... and what's the size of Waco, like the town? The city?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know, actually. I could tell you Baylor. Baylor's about 15,000 students, which I found was a really nice size, you know? It's like big enough where you're always meeting new people, but small enough where you see the people you know.
And did you find that it was supportive of kind of your freestyle arts, like your music and other interests that you had?
Definitely. I feel like Waco is only, 90 miles away from Austin, and I feel like it has a lot of Austin's kind of vibe, particularly amongst the college kids there. So there were like music-friendly coffee shops, and just kind of you could find an indie enclave in that city pretty easily.
And I find studying, if you just go to class, you go to all your classes, you do all your readings, you do all your assignments, you take all that seriously, that is a full-time job.
Yeah.
So that in itself is pretty exhaustive. You said that you did your CD in your spare time. Did you find that you went away from the storytelling for a sort of concerted reason, or is it more just that you kind of got into other things and it just kind of drifted away because of?
Well, at that point, I wasn't doing storytelling at all. I didn't really even know that was like a performance thing. I did actively choose not to take part in theater, though.
And why was that?
Because I wanted the degree to fall back on.
So not even in your spare time?
No. I mean, I still went to plays and movies and things like that, but I didn't participate in a performance aspect. I did have that band, and we would perform around town, but I didn't do any acting at all. It was hard. It was sad.
And how did you find? So was this the first time you lived away from home?
Yeah.
And how was that process? Like, kind of leaving the garage?
It was great. It was great. It was really good for me. I also think the distance from my house was great. So Waco is equidistant between Dallas and Austin. So I would spend most of my weekends in Austin because it's such a great city. But then I was also only an hour and a half away from home. So I would go home when I wanted, but I was far enough away from home to not go when I didn't want to go. So I think it was perfect, actually.
And at this time, so when did you think about, because obviously you're in grad school right now still, what part of your time at Baylor did you think, I'm happy with this, I'm happy with my intellectual growth, personal growth? When did you think that you were going to go and do some graduate study?
It's funny. I didn't, my master's kind of fell in my lap, to be honest with you. I took a year off between undergrad and grad school because I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do, and I had like 3 jobs that I like to say where I was like trying on. I loved animals, as you can tell from this story that you just heard. So I worked at a zoo that year. I was the person who went around to all the elementary schools with the animals hanging off of me, like, don't touch the clay kids. Like, that was me. That was an awesome job. I basically wanted to be David Attenborough when I grew up. And then I also got an agent and did some acting because I had missed it, and I thought maybe I wanted to go back to it already and be a professional actress. And then I did some substitute teaching because I was interested in being an English teacher, even back then. So I took the GRE on a whim almost, just because I knew if I did want to pursue the teaching thing, then I would have to get a master's. So it was one of those tiny decisions that you make that you look back and realize decided so much, It was this tiny decision at the end of the GRE where there was an optional survey. Like, if you want to stay and fill this out, you can, and if not, you can go. And we had, of course, been there for 4 hours, so the vast majority of the room, got the F out of there. And I was like, sure, I'll stay. Whatever, it was 5-10 minutes. And they were asking questions, what are you interested in going to grad school for? What do you want to do? And then there was one question at the end, like, is it okay if schools contact you? And I was like, sure, whatever. Harvard emailed me, like, 3 months later or whenever it was. I never would have thought about leaving Texas. I never would have thought about this program at all. I never would have even pursued it. So the first time I saw Boston was in a U-Haul moving there 4 months later.
And they just contacted you out of the blue?
Well, they contacted me because they were looking for people interested in masters in education. And I had said yes, it's okay for schools to contact me.
Okay, and then it's funny, so I read somewhere years ago when I lived in the UK, and they talked about people going to Oxbridge schools, Oxford and Cambridge. And what they said was one of the biggest impediments wasn't the financial aid, wasn't the universities being open to them. It was the fact that they had guidance counselors at these schools where they're trying to get more public school students, and the guidance counselors would go, oh, we haven't had anyone here in 25 years that have gone to Oxbridge, so we don't even push people towards it. So was that completely out of like just your high school, grade school experience?
Was what completely?
Thinking about going to like out of state and into like bigger Ivy League schools.
I didn't think about it. Is what I was saying.
Yeah.
Like, I never would have.
So do
thought about it.
you think that was just you, or do you think that was just more of a general vibe in the area?
I don't know. I mean, there are plenty of people who go to the Northeast from Texas for school reasons, and that was always their plan. I guess it's because I didn't come from an academic family. It was just never. I knew I was going to college, but then after that, I didn't really know, which is why I took that year off and was doing these 3 very different things, and it was almost like I needed that for someone to email me and say, like, you could do this here.
And if you didn't get the email, I mean, it's always weird to speculate. What do you think you would have done
I have
instead?
no idea, dude. Like, I think at that point that through my substitute teaching, I was figuring out how much I loved kids, and that I probably eventually would have pursued that in some way, but I wouldn't have applied to Harvard. I probably would have just gone to UT or something.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, so you've been listening to WBAR, WBAR, Barnard College Freeform Radio. My name is Dino. You're listening to Christine Gentry talking about storytelling and her path to that. So next, we're going to be talking to Christine about her transition to Harvard in the Boston area, as well as her time here at Columbia University. You're listening to WBAR, WBAR, Barnard College Radio here in New York City. My name is Dino, your host for Ovation, the Performing Arts Show. So we're here with our good friend, Ms. Christine Gentry. Christine's a storyteller who's been active with the Moth and a number of other organizations here in the city and beyond. So in our first couple of segments, we've been talking to Christine about a number of things, her childhood in Texas, as well as her transition to Waco, Texas, to go to Baylor for her undergraduate degree. So now we've kind of followed you up to the Northeast, and now we're currently, let's pretend we're in Boston.
Okay.
So how did you get into Boston again? You had an email, and then what happened after you received the email inviting you, I guess, to apply? Mm-hmm. What happened next?
I applied.
That is great. End of story. We're done today.
Scene. I got in. I couldn't afford to check anything out beforehand, so like I told you, I just jumped in a U-Haul with a lot of faith and no small amount of nervousness and moved to Boston. I think that was June of 2004.
Wow.
And then did this really intense master's program at Harvard. It was 11 months, so I had no time to do anything else except that master's program.
And what was so intense? The course load, the homework, the reading?
Everything. It was fitting 2 years of coursework into 11 months, and on top of that, student teaching.
And the name of the program was?
It's the teacher education program, so it was made to train people how to be urban public school teachers. And so you do your student teaching in a public school in Boston while you're taking classes at Harvard. And it was an MED in English education, so I took both English classes in the yard and also education classes at the ed school.
How was your first experiences teaching in a Boston area public school?
Well, the first year, so after I graduated, student teaching doesn't really count. You learn a lot, but it doesn't really count. My first year of teaching was in Boston Public, and it was, I commonly refer to it as the winter of my life. It was very hard. Very, very hard. The school was dysfunctional in a lot of ways, and of course I didn't know what I was doing, and I taught 120-minute blocks with 36 kids in a room with 31 desks, and it was violent and scary, and it was pretty awful.
So it's kind of like hosting a radio show like this one.
It's a lot like it.
Ho, ho,
Ho, ho, ho.
Oh, ho, ho. Okay, so, and was it just your first year was tough?
Yeah.
Or...
I mean, teaching, first of all, to be clear, teaching is hard. I'm convinced.
It is hard work. It is hard work.
I'm convinced that it's one of the hardest things to do well under the sun. But when I found a school that was functional and amazing and taught the same population but had its act together, that's where I went my second year and stayed there for the rest of my time in Boston. It was a wonderful place.
Could you talk about your transition? Like, okay, so say it's the end of your first year teaching. Did you ever for a moment think it was you, or did you always think it was a school? Was it a combination of the two?
Oh, of course. Part of the reason why I've been, to whatever extent I've been successful in academic endeavors is because I'm extremely hard on myself. So of course I blamed myself for not doing as good of a job. of course, in hindsight, a lot of the blame lies on the school and the dysfunction of the school, but I also, like, didn't know what I was doing. Like, all first-year teachers suck. Like, all of us. We all suck. So we have to figure it out. It's purification through fire. So as difficult as that year was, I think I was, the learning curve was so steep that by the time I got to my second year, I knew a lot about myself and about teaching that I probably wouldn't have been able to learn if I had gone to, a safer school that had its act together. And I just learned a lot because I had to, right? Like, by the end of that year, I had made an island. My room was an island, and it was safe, and it was a place where learning was happening. And that took a lot of work.
What kids were you teaching? What level? And were you teaching exclusively English education, or was it a more of a wide diversity of classes?
And I was an English teacher. My first year was 9th and 10th. And then at that second school, I was mostly 10th grade, but taught a few juniors, a few sections of the juniors, and some freshmen.
Did you enjoy just teaching English?
Of course. It's awesome. It's a dream job.
Did you stay at the same school for your next several years?
Mm-hmm.
And was that your entire time? Was that the second school?
Yeah, so I taught for 5 total before coming to the BHC program. 4 of them were at that second school.
Okay, so can you talk about your development as a teacher over the course of those 5 years? Did you find yourself, was it something that you could kind of notice, or was it something really kind of natural and it took 5 years for you to become?
No, of course you notice. I feel like teaching is a skill, right? So you get better at it as you practice, and I definitely noticed myself becoming stronger. And the school noticed it too, so part of the reason why I transitioned to the PhD program is because my last 2 years at that school, they gave me a student teacher. So I was a mentor for this person who was in my room full time. Eventually took over 2 of my classes, and I loved watching them do it. And hopefully, obviously, there's a social justice aspect to my work, and it was nice to think that because this is such a hard thing to do, and because I've managed to learn how to do it well, like teaching people how to do it could expand that effect. So I decided my 4th year at that school, my 5th year teaching, that I wanted to be an urban teacher educator. So I started looking for doctoral programs that would allow me to do that, and came to Columbia.
And I could kind of I have a background in education, and the terms seem to imply what they mean, but what exactly is an urban teacher educator?
Somebody who teaches in a public school in the city would be the easiest way to define it. I think like Title I public schools would be a even more specific thing to say. So schools where high majority of students are below the poverty line.
Did you ever think about your time at Boston of going to the equivalent of a charter school or a private school?
One more time?
Did you ever think, because you're at a public school, did you ever think during that time of going to a private school or the equivalent of a charter school, like a sort of one that caters to a higher socioeconomic status?
Well, charter schools are still public schools like that. I never wanted to.
But like sort of like one that there's a lottery, so it seems like it's more selective. People often seem to perceive that charters are maybe
we're hitting on something I'm glad to talk about. I think there are a lot of myths about charter schools. The charter schools that do it right get all the 8th graders in their district to get into the lottery, right? So that they're not like skimming off the top. But I've seen them serve kids right. No, I had no desire to go to a private school at all.
And why was that?
Honestly, it's more selfish than anything. I think partly because of how I grew up, and partly because of the experiences that I've had, I enjoy teaching this population so much. I don't want to. I think it would be less enjoyable for me to teach a group of kids that come from great privilege. I think I have more fun with these kids. They're my people. They're who I grew up with. They're who I enjoy having conversations with. Also, selfishly, as an English teacher, talking about, reading Richard Wright's Black Boy, for example, where he's talking about having to choose between stealing or not eating, and then talking about that with a group of kids, some of whom know what that choice is like. Like that discussion is so much richer than someone who has no idea, who has never gone through any real tribulation yet.
Could you talk about your transition from Boston eventually? Why did you think about going to do a doctoral degree at Boston or anywhere else other than New York?
Yeah, I applied to Boston College. They have a good PhD program along the lines of that, and then I also applied to NYU and Columbia. But Columbia was the best match for me as far as what they had, the program here, and I also met with some of the professors here and sat in on some classes and decided that this was the best match for me.
Cool. So let's talk about your transition. Like, so you packed up your bags, and what happened?
I packed up my bags. I moved to Harlem and started this program in 2010, fall of 2010. And I'm defending in a month.
Yes.
And I'm excited about it.
Wow.
So I did full-time coursework and got that out of the way in 2.5 years.
Could you talk about your academic growth here at Columbia?
Wow, well, Jesus, a lot. That's a lot of growth.
It's 4 years. It's hard to.
I learned a lot. I think academic growth and professional growth are kind of intertwined for me, and so it's been interesting not only learning a lot about my field, but also learning a lot about myself and my place in it. So I kind of decided probably about a year ago that I couldn't take a job that would be 100% academia. I decided that wouldn't make me happy. I have a teenager-sized hole in my life, and I must be with teenagers in a meaningful and daily way. But I also have this PhD, and I want to use it to teach teachers, so I had to find a job that would allow me to do both. And I did. I'm excited about that, too.
And what job is that?
That is, I'm going to Boston to be the director of certification at a network of charter schools, which is why I wanted to talk about those. So I would be in charge of all the student teachers across the network, and then I would also have a class or two of my own English kiddos.
And like a class or two a week?
No, full time.
So would you work
They
within
would be my kids.
So like like you said, like a network. So would you have like an office separate from the charter schools, but then you'd be based at one of the schools?
My office would be based in the
schools.
flagship school, yeah, and that's where I would teach the kids.
You'd be carrying the flag.
Exactly, on my back.
So, yeah, we're talking about. So again, this is Ovation, the performing arts show. My name is Dino, and you're listening to WBAR, Barnard College, Freeform Radio. We're here with storyteller Christine Gentry. So, Christine, could you talk about your time here at Columbia and how that brought you back to storytelling and not purely just teacher education?
Right. I don't think I can talk about that without talking about the moth. So.
Go ahead.
I'm going to assume your listeners know what it is.
Could you explain the moth?
Okay. It's a storytelling nonprofit. It's based here in New York. It has 3 branches, and if you've heard of it, you've probably heard of one of 2, which is the Story Slams. So if you have a 5-minute story on whatever theme is that night, you put your name in a bag, they pull 10 people, they tell stories, fun. There's also the main stage where you pay, $40 a ticket to see relatively famous people tell stories from their lives. So most people, if they know the podcast, they know these 2 branches. They have a popular podcast. I work for the community education branch, which is, I'm biased, but it's my favorite part. And that's where we go into, typically underserved populations, so like prisons and rehab centers and halfway houses and Title I urban public schools and things like that. We do these really intense storytelling workshops with them, and then we put on showcases of their stories. And I found them because I found the Moth podcast when I was in Boston, and I loved it. So as soon as I moved to New York, I sought the Moth out immediately. Started putting my name into slams and eventually meeting the education people. And the original plan was to create some kind of collaboration between the Moth and Student Press Initiative, which is the other educational nonprofit I work for. But then eventually that seemed too big for my dissertation. I wanted to just focus in on the oral storytelling aspect, and so that's what ended up happening. So I did my field work at a Moth community education workshop this fall in a public school in East New York, Brooklyn, and now I'm writing it. Almost done.
And you're defending it
April 23rd.
Dun 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 dun. Could you talk a little bit about your so how do you feel now that you're coming towards the twilight of your time here at in both Columbia but also New York City?
I'm excited about this job. I think it's really dreamy. I'm really sad about leaving New York. I've loved it here, but it just I looked, and this kind of position just doesn't exist here yet. I think it might someday. there's a lot of talk in the field about teacher education and how most of our teacher education programs don't really work, or at least don't work well, which I think is true. And I feel now strongly that student teachers should be immersed completely. So, like, teacher education programs should look like apprenticeships, where you're in the school full time. You're not just like clocking in your punch card, for however many hours of observation and however many hours of lesson planning and whatever. Like, you're actually in a school learning how it works, because it's a skill. You have to learn that way, and talking about theory is only going to help you so much once you're finally in front of 36 kids. So I needed to find a school that was not only doing teacher education that way, but would also allow me to teach kids. And so if I had to blueprint a job, it would be this one. So in that way, I'm very excited to go to Boston, but I will miss New York.
And did they email you to come to do this job, or were you just looking around thinking, I'm graduating, let's start looking around?
I feel like I can't even answer this question without sounding like such a jerk. No, they found me. They did, but it's
you don't even apply for jobs.
They knew me. They knew me though. It's not like they were seeking someone out, and then Googled and found me. It's like they knew me as a person. They knew I'd be good for it. So.
And how do you think your time both being in Boston and public schools, and then being in public and charter schools, and then being in schools here, how do you think do you think there's a big difference between the school climates? Do you think this has helped you because it's a different city, serving a slightly different clientele of people?
I was actually really surprised at the similarities between New York and Boston. So, public schools is a big umbrella. So underneath that umbrella is both district schools. So those are schools that have the DOE, so New York City DOE or Boston Public Schools Department of Education. And then there's charter schools that are also public, but they have a direct relationship with the state, right? So they don't have to answer to the district. And I've found similarities in both, actually. So I taught in both Boston's district schools and a Boston charter school, and then I've been doing my push-in educational nonprofit work, both in New York City district schools and New York City charter schools, and there's a lot of similarities between them. The kids are very similar. The systems are very similar, both in good and bad ways. And I feel like it's just been an extra 4 years of teaching experience for me.
Have you been doing, besides your actual moth-related work, have you been doing any, like you said with your SPI, can you explain some of your storytelling work with kids?
Yeah, Student Press Initiative is an educational nonprofit based in Teachers College. So they basically have mostly writing, but the idea is to get kids writing and go public with it. And so I actually created a program there called Spoken Stories, which was similar. So we would go into District 79 schools. Do you know that? This alternative school district. So we would go into them and do a variety of oral publications, is what we called it. So some kids did spoken word, and some kids did oral storytelling, and some kids did PSAs and stuff like that. And then we did professional videography of their performances and put those online for them, and that was awesome.
What's the importance of going public with the work?
Well, a lot of my dissertation is about that, right? So the difference between writing a story about yourself and telling a story about yourself. So I can speak from personal experience as well, which I think might be more appropriate because we'll talk about the dissertation later. But the difference between writing those stories as a kid, right? So those stories I used to write when I was little and keep in my room and never really share with anyone except my best friends. And then the process of eventually getting up in front of hundreds of people and telling a very personal story about myself. And when you tell a story out loud, it's only going to be told that way once, right? So even if you were to stand up and read something, when the words are lifted off the page, it's different. And there's also this electric current that's taking place between you and the people watching you. It's magic, and it's powerful in a way, and I use that word purposefully because I think that powerful is a double-edged sword adjective. It could be really good, and it could be really bad.
Have you had some mixed experiences?
Oh, yes.
And just personally or professionally or both?
Well, I guess we could call me a professional storyteller because I do it pretty regularly around the city, but it's also extremely personal storytelling, so I think that those are intertwined, personal and professional. But yeah, totally. There have been performances that felt right and felt good, and there have been performances that were awful and made me feel exposed and bad. So we can talk about those if you want.
Yeah, because again, I've done some performance-based things where I've done the exact same material, the exact same format, the exact same way, night after night. And the first night was excellent, the second night was terrible.
Yeah.
And I would be like, oh, now I try not to invite people to see my things because I'm never sure. So could you explain maybe some of the factors why did these things happen the way they did?
I think for me, a lot of it has to do with connection with the audience. So, for example, the story that you heard earlier, that was recorded at a venue where the lights were on me, certainly, but I could see people still. And so not only could I see them, I could hear them. They were laughing at things or gasping at things, and they were taking part in the construction of that story, right? And I was connecting with them through eye contact and through hearing each other. And then take another performance, for example, in the East Village, where I was standing on a stage that had lights that were so bright. I was completely blinded. I couldn't see even the outline of human beings, much less make eye contact with anyone. And it was a more serious story, so like they weren't laughing because it wasn't funny. And so I couldn't hear them. I couldn't see them. I felt like a deer in headlights. I was just talking to myself and sharing this personal thing without being able to see that someone was hearing me and listening to me, right? And it was awful. Like, awful. When I got off the stage, I felt nauseous. You know, they clapped, they were polite, but I have to be able to see people. And I don't think that it's just me.
And this might be a fine point, and I don't know if you can really answer this, but because you're a professional, and you know how I'm sure that you gave your story in that situation a proper delivery, do you think they noticed?
Do you think they noticed that I was feeling awful?
Yeah, like you know, because you know how you can kind of give this air of authority, and they might not notice, and maybe it's more dramatic, and there's not that interaction you normally have. Say if it's comedic, do you think they noticed?
Oh yeah, I'm sure they did. I'm sure they noticed not only that my face was getting red because I was miserable, but also like I'm sure by the, you know, I started off pretty strong, but then by the time I realized I wasn't getting any feedback from them and I couldn't see them, I would say by the middle of my story at the very latest, I was just rushing it. I was clearly rushing it. I wanted to get it over with. I was not sitting with the moments that I would normally sit with if it were going well. I was just like cutting things and moving on and just really wanted it to be done.
Okay, given that you want things to go public, you want to lift things from the page, I think that's good for students. How do you prepare, if you can, students that you're working with, knowing that there are going to be some performances that are going to be fantastic, uplifting, life-changing experiences, and then conversely, there'll be ones that won't be quite so good. So do you address that?
Yeah, of course. I think that's important. The Moth actually has a storytelling bill of rights that we give every student that we work with. That includes you have the right to opt out of this at any time. You have the right to decide how public your story is. You have the right to decide what story you're going to tell. You have the right to refuse any of the revision notes we give you. So, I mean, it's long. It's a whole page. But the idea being that we warn them ahead of time and are very candid about the power of going public with personal stories. Like, we get to leave in 16 weeks. You have to stay in school with these same people for years. So you choose carefully what story you want to share with them and make sure that you're ready for them to not respect, you know, we're going to enforce safe space rules while we're here, but we don't have control over what people do with your story after you tell it.
Can you talk about, given that, can you talk about your relationship with these students and maybe some of the supervisors, the teachers, the educators that you work with? Again, given that, you know, you're working with some live organic matter that's not completely controllable. Like, are they supportive of you? Do they understand some of the risks involved?
Yeah, I think, well, that's my job, right? To make sure that they understand the risks involved. I think as far as relationships go, like that's the currency of instruction. You can't do anything if you don't have a relationship with a kid. So the Moth and Student Pest Initiative, I feel, does a lot of work at the beginning of a workshop to make sure that relationships are built that can then be banked on later for classroom management issues or also motivation and trust and things like that.
Given your studies of English education, could you talk about how that may have informed your storytelling process and your reintegration to the storytelling community here, as opposed to when you're in Boston, it seems like you did other things?
I think English education, probably the biggest thing it did is the similarities between oral storytelling and writing, you know, because they're both crafting. They're both crafting the stories, and you have to make decisions as a storyteller that are similar to the ones you would make as a writer, as far as how to describe something, how to organize a story. And so in that way, I feel like the similarities between... I've always been a writer, but I feel like getting further into the study of writing. And also, of course, for my dissertation, I read 10,000 pages about storytelling and identities and storytelling and relationships, and that taught me the world about it, obviously.
Were there a couple of major takeaways, like things that you came up with in your research and your reading that were mind-blowing to you, that changed maybe the way that you think about storytelling, the way that you perform storytelling, or the process of doing that?
Sure, lots, but I'll pick one. I think this is a deceptively simple thing, you know.
Yeah, I think a lot of really good things are deceptively simple.
But it's really kind of profound when you think about it. Is that the stories that we choose to tell about ourselves, or the stories we choose to write about ourselves, they construct us as much as we construct them. Does that make sense?
Say that one more time. So
Yeah.
I just want to rehear that.
Yeah. So we speak and write ourselves into being in a really powerful way. So like the stories we choose to tell about ourselves, they're constructed by us, clearly. We're making choices when we construct them. But what we might not realize is that they're constructing us as well. So when we tell a story about an event, that story is actually shaping your memory of that event.
You're listening to WBAR, WBAR, Barnard College Radio. My name is Dino, your friendly and kind host. This is Ovation, the Performing Arts Show. We focus on performing arts across the city of New York, and today we're with storyteller Christine Gentry. This is our lightning round section of the show.
Yes.
We're going to talk a little bit about the future of storytelling. I might as well just ask the question, what do you think is the future of storytelling? That's the whole segment. You have 18 minutes to talk.
Oh, no.
In the beginning...
I think storytelling is getting really hot right now. It's hard to tell whether it's getting hot all across the country. I think it is. New York seems kind of like the hub of it. And the Moth has a lot to do with that, I feel. That people have loved the podcast. It's been very popular and has spawned a lot of sister shows and sister podcasts. And I think right now the kind of storytelling scene in New York, we are having discussions about what that's going to look like, you know, because of the explosion. Like, what do we want storytelling to look like? What are the rules with storytelling when it comes to, like, how much is true and things like that? These are decisions that individual show producers make, but also I feel it's a bigger conversation with storytelling in general. My thinking, which is connected to my dissertation, my voice in that conversation has to do lately with more like being careful. Because of what I said earlier about the power of storytelling, I feel sometimes people get very excited about it, and this was me 4 years ago, right? You get very excited about it, you're in a rush to tell all of your stories and to get everyone else's stories without really thinking of some of the risks involved. So that's kind of the voice that I'm trying to be in that conversation.
Why do you think that that storytelling has become hot over the last couple of years in New York City and beyond?
I think, you know, the guy who started the Moth, his name is George Das Green, and he is a Georgian. He's a poet from the South, and he started it because when he moved up here, he realized in the 90s that nobody talked to each other in real ways, you know, like they're all just running around having lunch with each other, and so rarely do they sit the way he used to with his friends in Georgia on a wraparound porch and just drink whiskey and tell stories until 2 a.m., you know. And so he started the Moth in his living room to force people to sit and listen to each other tell long stories about their lives. And of course it blew up into what it is now with millions of people listening and slams across the country and in the education program and things like that. So I think part of it comes from the way that our culture is moving technologically. There's a lot of movement from the face to the screen, you know. And I feel that the kind of long history that we have as humans of firelit tales and the way we talked and communicated with each other for so long, and then on that timeline of how long we've been around, it's just a tiny hair's breadth of it has been the technological typing, right? and seeing things on screen. And I feel like we're evolutionarily wired to tell stories to each other, and we don't really do that in a lot of ways, though, in our like fast-paced city technological life. And so we have this yearning that we can't quite identify, and then when we hear something like The Moth or go to a storytelling show, we're like, that's the thing I've been missing. Why is this so great? It's such a simple thing. Like, someone stands up and tells a story about their lives. Like, why is that so hot? Why did it take so long for us to figure out that that's a worthwhile thing to do with an evening? I don't know. I think it has to do with the way we communicate by text so often, and we use it to expedite our lives and make things easier. But we also lose so much about that face-to-face communication.
So the podcast is very big. Do you have any thoughts? And you're talking about maybe the distinction between sound and screen. Do you think there'd be something lost or gained by having like a video version of it?
No, I don't think anything's lost. I mean, The Moth also has a very popular YouTube channel, and so people watch videos of the stories. And to be clear, the Moth podcast came from the Moth live shows, so it's watching somebody tell a story that's really what the Moth is. If anything, there's something to be lost when you just take the audio. So no, I think it's even better if you get to see the person.
What do you think of the composition of the audience is? Is it young, old, a mixture?
Okay, it's total NPR crowd. If you go to a Moth show or any storytelling show in the city, everyone there knows what NPR is. Everybody loves This American Life. Everybody has a crush on Hourglass. Everybody, like, it's just, that's actually right now what I hope to push, right? I hope to push the edges of the population that's being drawn into storytelling. I feel like part of the Moth Shop community education program is that we're going into populations that don't listen to NPR and they don't know what the Moth is and they don't really care, right? So like a lot of times you show up to a group full of well-educated white people and you're like, I work for the Moth, and they're like, oh my god, I love the Moth. And then if you go to the schools that we're in, the prisons that we're in, we're like, what the F is the Moth? Who cares? Right?
They're afraid of moths.
Well, they just the point being that this is awesome stuff, and the people who are seeking it out right now is a very specific population of generally well-educated, generally white, generally middle class or higher people. And I feel like bringing this stuff not only to others, but also like mining the natural resource that is, like, a lot of these working class people come from oral backgrounds, right? So like families who tell stories as part of their culture, but they're not the ones being put on NPR.
And so how do you invite them in to this conversation, to this storytelling world that seems, again, specific to a really, when you described it, a pretty narrow segment of society?
Well, it's what the Moth Shop community education program is. We go into these populations that wouldn't otherwise find us. And we're like, hey, this is what we do. We think you'd be great at it. Let's teach you how to do it. And then we put on a showcase of their stories. And
how do you what's the relationship to getting into these communities?
Right now it's less streamlined than I think it should be and is going to be. Right now it's more just like there's one person in charge of the entire program, which is just too much responsibility. And people seek him out, so he'll get emails from maybe a teacher who works at a school who knows the Moth podcast and is like, please come in and work with my kids. Or a nonprofit that works with a particular population and knows the Moth. So it's usually like one person from the population that I referred to, like that small population, who works with another population but knows the Moth and connects the two. What I think will eventually happen is that we'll have some sort of system to seek them out instead.
How do you find youth these days who are so technologically advanced respond to something so old school as a person getting up in front of them and talking?
It's not a hard sell, dude. They're hardwired. We are hardwired to tell stories and to listen to stories. It's not a hard sell at all. First thing you do is you tell a story to them. And they all listen. And they are all attentive. And they all have amazing things to say about your story and the choices you made as a storyteller. I think it's actually the easiest thing I've ever done as a teacher, is to get a kid interested in storytelling. Because it's natural. It's the stuff of first dates. It's the stuff of interviews. It's the stuff of dinner conversations. It's what we do anyway. It's just formalizing it.
There's always this weird distinction between curricular-based school activities and extracurricular, and this obviously feels more extracurricular. What do you think the role of stories are in K-12 education and properly written into a curriculum?
I know for myself, now that I've seen what it can do, that I can't imagine ever returning to the classroom without making this a part of my class. I know it's a tough sell when you're, particularly for schools that are, the kids are performing below grade level and the school has greater accountability for meeting things like state test standards and things like that. So I've definitely had conversations with principals that are like, we can't afford to give you 16 hours of instruction time. Like, that's not going to happen. And I hear them. I hear their argument. My argument is that your kids are probably underperforming because they don't care. They don't care enough. Or maybe they're not even coming, right? Relationships are the currency of instruction. If you can do something in your room that will allow kids to be more motivated, not only to be there, but to work harder for you, then it's worth it. It's worth the time you're doing. And so this work has the potential to increase student investment in the classroom, in the teacher, and in their classmates. And that is worth its weight in gold when it comes to getting them to work harder on other things.
Is there space currently in the English language arts curriculum, either in New York State, New York City, or Massachusetts, that has stories as a part of it?
Yeah, so both New York and Massachusetts are in the Common Core road, the Common Core state standards. So, and the work I do with the Moth actually applies to quite a few Common Core state standard things. Because again, of what we talked about earlier with the similarities between crafting an oral story and crafting a written one. So you have to make decisions about language and word choice and organization and details and things like that that are actually part of the Common Core.
Cool.
So that's another argument for why it was a worthwhile thing to do in class.
What do you think you can learn from doing stories that you couldn't learn from other forms of curriculum or subject matter?
The cheating answer is that you learn more about the people who are telling stories to you. Like, where else in the room would you find out that your teacher and her mom had a big fight when she was 16, right? Or that your buddy who sits next to you lost his brother when he was 6, or something like that. There are these things that you find out about each other that become the building blocks of trust between you, right? And the vulnerability creates that trust and that connection with someone. So that's cheating, clearly, because where else would you find out something like that unless you did a personal narrative writing unit? But I think that's a worthwhile thing.
Kids these days are obviously, like adults, really into technology. Are there advantages to having wired kids in terms of intermingling that with storytelling? Are they at odds? How do they relate, if at all?
I don't know if they're at odds so much. I think maybe the only thing that might be happening is that they're not used to. Sometimes they're not used to telling long stories. Like, I remember when I was a kid, sitting in the hallway, twirling the curly Q phone cord in my fingers and talking to my friends until midnight, just telling stories. And now kids are just texting back and forth or Facebook messaging back and forth. Like, how often do they actually have real conversations with each other? And so in that sense, sometimes we might have a little bit of work to do to get them more comfortable doing that and listening to that. The listening piece particularly. Like, sometimes it doesn't come naturally to kids who are always on their phones to stop looking at your GD phone for 5 minutes and just listen to someone. Like, that's sometimes a lesson that we have to teach them that maybe we wouldn't have in the 80s when I was a kid.
So again, you talked about before when we were off mic, about how Boston didn't have a slam when you were there, and now they do. Obviously, New York's grown. There's other Moth slams and other shows across the country. What do you think's going to happen with the Moth or other storytelling venues in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think it'll just get even bigger. It'll be huge. I mean, I feel like it's going to be. There seems to be some parallels between what's happening right now with the storytelling scene and what happened with stand-up comedy in the 80s. Like, it started off as this small kind of basement thing, again in New York, and people, it caught on and it started spreading, and then there were TV shows, and I feel like eventually, and maybe within 10, 15 years, there's going to be specials, HBO specials for professional storytellers, things like that.
Cool. Awesome. So that was Christine talking about the future of Storytelling. She's looked into the crystal ball. We have a crystal ball here. There's a crystal ball. This is kind of a big crystal ball. It's our CD library. I see CDs in the future. Actually, CDs are a thing of the past, I would guess.
They are.
So we're going to play a little bit more of our good friend, Mr. John Prine, and we'll come back and talk to Christine about her transition to becoming a professional storyteller. You're listening to WBAR, Barnard College Freeform Radio. This is Ovation, the Performing Arts Show. You're listening to WBAR, Barnard College Radio, here at Barnard College, Columbia University, City of New York. Whoop whoop, holla holla. My name is Dino. This is Ovation, the Performing Arts Show. And today we're here with Christine Gentry in our fifth and final segment. Mm-hmm. Christine, how are you feeling?
Feeling good.
She's feeling good. Whoop whoop. So we're going to talk a little bit about your life as a professional storyteller. How is life as a professional storyteller?
It's a blast.
What's good? What's bad? What are you indifferent about?
There's nothing bad. I mean, well, unless I get a show where I can't see people. I've figured that out. That's happened to me twice, which is a very small percentage of the shows that I've had. So, to be fair, that's rare. But now I know to look out for it. Like, if they're going to put me on a stage where I'm blinded and can't see people, I ask them not to do that at this point. But the vast majority of my experiences have been so very positive. I started off just putting my name to the Moth Slams. Yeah. Like consistently getting second place in all the slams. And almost like the way the Moth is, the audience is so supportive, everyone's so great. It seems like once you start getting second place, people seem to notice you more. They're like, oh, that girl, she's great. She always misses it by like 1/10 of a point. So I made a lot of friends, and people were coming up to me a lot from telling stories at the Moth. And the first time I was actually asked to do a show was after I told a teaching story. And in the audience was a producer of the Story Collider. And she came up and said, you should tell a story at our show. And I had never thought to pursue producers or to ask to be in shows. So that recording you played earlier today, it was actually my very first professional storytelling experience, and it went well. It was lovely, and from that, and they have a popular podcast as well, so from that people heard that, and other producers started contacting me, and then I feel like at this point the New York City storytelling scene is insular enough where people know my name, and producers will ask me to perform in their shows.
How do you come up with topics to write about? And once you come up with the topic, just talk about your writing process.
I don't write much when I'm prepping for oral storytelling, because the people who do that, in my opinion, you can see them from a mile away. They're monologuing. They're reading something that they've crafted in writing and have memorized, and that's not what oral storytelling is, not to me. So what I actually do is, whatever the show, most storytelling shows have themes, so I'll craft a story. At one point I sat down and wrote a giant list of what I thought was every story that I had. And so if something doesn't automatically come to mind that fits that theme that I've already crafted before, then I'll go through that giant list and find something. And what I'll end up doing is organizing it by bullet points. So I have a memorized first line and I have a memorized last line. So I know exactly where I'm beginning and exactly where I'm ending. But then the rest is just bullet points of things I know I want to hit organizationally, right? So, for example, in that story, it was the 4 lessons, right? And then there was like a 1-word bullet point underneath. So like Black Widow, Charlie, things like that. And then I end up telling it more or less off the cuff, the Black Widow and Charlie parts.
So do you, how do you practice, or how do you rehearse these stories? Do you rehearse, or is it you have the bullet points?
I do, and I want to make it very clear that this is my process. I'm not like the capital WA to do storytelling, but what works for me, I figured out through trial and error, is that I can't run a story more than 3 times before I tell it, because of the way my memory works. So if I start telling it, if I tell it more than 3 times, then there will be chunks that end up memorized. And I'll tell them, and it will come across, at least to me, as memorized. So what I do is I run it 3 times to make sure that the time is accurate. So all producers will give you time, so 8 to 10 or 10 to 15 or whatever. And you want to be respectful of them and your fellow storytellers. So you want to make sure that whatever story you're going to tell is not going to go over and also not be wildly under. So for that reason, I do it 3 times to make sure it's consistently running within the time they gave me, and also that the organization feels right, and that there's nothing that is stumbling block.
Going back to your earlier years, and you talked about the gentleman who started the Moth being a Southern gentleman from Georgia, and the South having a strong storytelling culture. Did you get some of that from your family? Did you get some of that from your community? Where did your kind of maybe style emanate from? And obviously it's developed over the years.
My dad is such a naturally gifted storyteller. It's not something I really realized until I started analyzing it on a meta level, but he is so good. I watched him recently. We went to my cousin's wedding in Colorado, and I watched him with a table full of people just eating out of his hand, telling a story that I knew very well, you know, a story from my childhood. And I was like, oh my God, so much of the things that I thought were my own were really just him. Like, he's so good at this. He's funny, his timing is great, he knows how to impersonate people, he's hyperbolic. He's just got all of the things about Southern, you know, when you think about Southern storytellers and how they can just magically entrance an audience. He's got that. So I feel like I stole a lot of that from him without even realizing I was doing it.
And looking in retrospect, you talked about how you were a shy girl. Do you think this is something, part of the performance process is becoming a performer and becoming the performance you? Was this something that you think you had inside the whole time? It's partly genetic, and then over time, the little turtle came out of its shell, and then you just evolved into this? Or what was the process into becoming?
Yeah, I mean, storytelling requires no small amount of bravery, and certainly no small amount of confidence. Like, it's scary to go up there. Like, it's almost scarier to go up there because it's not memorized, or because you're not reading it, because of the unexpected. You don't know. You're going off the cuff. And again, so much of it is dependent on that audience. If that audience is not there with you, then, and you don't have it memorized, you have no safety net. It's like circus performing. So in that way, I had to grow up into owning who I was and being more confident before public storytelling was even an option for me. But I do agree with you. There was something internal all along, which is why I was making those silly little books, you know.
You spoke about reading so much when you were young, and obviously you're an English ed, and you're an English teacher, so you'd read a lot. What do you think the role of reading has played in you becoming a storyteller? Like, do you think you've internalized some things, some flourishes, some themes?
Reading, it probably only helped me to the extent that it's helped me with writing, if that makes sense. So when you become a reader, particularly when you're an English teacher reading, you're always thinking on a meta level about author choice. And in that sense, all the reading that I do and love has taught me a lot about story and how to craft story and where you can play with organization and word choice and things like that. But the performance aspect of it was something I had to learn from experience and also from watching some of the masters in the city. There's some really awesome storytellers here.
Could you talk about some of the people that you really like here or from your past, and what are the characteristics you find in them that are particularly appealing to you as a storyteller?
3 people come to mind immediately of people who I consider, even though they don't know it, like mentors of mine.
They'll know now. We're sending them a tape.
When it comes to storytelling, one is Peter Aguero, one is Jeff Zimmerman, and one is Aaron Barker. And those 3 people come to mind immediately because they were some of the first 3 people that I sat and listened to and was like, holy crap, what is happening to me? Like, listening to this person, I'm so moved by their story. I want to pay attention to what they're doing to make me feel this way because I want to be able to do that to others. And so they're very different storytellers. Like, Peter and Jeff are a little more similar. The Aaron Barker, she's very different. But they all managed to tell these stories about ostensibly tiny moments that were so important and revealed so much about themselves and their relationships with the people in it. And they've taught me a lot about how to do that. Definitely. And they each have storytelling shows of their own now, by the way. They're all 3 of those people are producers of their own shows.
So you work with the Moth Shop storytelling, as a Moth Shop storytelling instructor. How does that play into your professional storytelling growth?
Well, we're getting into my teaching philosophy a little bit, but I think one of the most effective ways to become better at any kind of art is to teach it, right? Because it forces you to come up with the language to teach someone else how to do it. And that's also true about teaching. Like, if you can't explain to someone how you're doing something like that, then you actually don't really understand it yourself. So in that sense, teaching storytelling to high school students has forced me to think about a lot of my own choices as a storyteller, and also because it's important to my teaching philosophy to model for kids and to be brave for kids and to be vulnerable for kids. The fact that every single workshop I've ever done for the Moth, I've told at least one story to that group of kids in the first or second visit. And so those stories that I've been telling these kids over the years have turned out to be some of my best stories, I feel, because I've been working on them for kids specifically.
Oh, what do you think of your future growth? Like, where do you expect to grow as an artist over the next couple of years?
Honestly, I'm a little worried about not having time to do this. I'm taking this new job that's going to require a lot of me, time and energy-wise. I'm glad that Boston now has a slam. Boston now also has a few storytelling shows that I definitely plan on being involved in some way, but I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to throw myself into it the way that I have here as a grad student. Particularly, I'm so lucky that my dissertation was about oral storytelling, so I got to, use that as an excuse to just immerse myself even more in something that I was loving personally. So I'm worried about it, but I do plan on actively practicing and getting on stage as often as I can. And also, I'm only 4 hours from New York, so I'm hoping that the producers in the city will continue to book me every once in a while, and I'll come down and tell stories. But I definitely don't, I'm devoted to teaching, and I'm devoted to urban education, and so I don't have any plans to leave that for any kind of full-time storytelling gig.
Can you tell us, I know that you have a couple of shows coming up. Could you list them out? Do you mind?
Yes. Tonight, if you have no plans this evening, tonight I will be telling stories as a part of a really great lineup at a show called Honey and Poison, and it's at a little art house, Two Moon, I think is what it's called. Yeah, Two Moon Art House and Cafe in Brooklyn. So that's tonight at 8 o'clock, and then a little further on in the future, I will be performing on Saturday, May 3rd at the Liar Show, which, if you're listening to this and you don't know about the Liar Show, you have to go. It's so fun. So there are 4 storytellers, and only 3 of them are telling the truth, and you hear all 4 stories, and then you have a little time to come up with questions, and then the 4 storytellers stand on the stage and you interrogate them, trying to poke holes in their stories, and then you vote on the one that you thought was a liar, and if you were correct, you get a t-shirt. So I'm not going to tell you whether or not I'm going to be the liar, but you should come on Saturday, May 3rd at Cornelia Street Cafe at 6 p.m. To check that out. And then further in the future, which is Thursday, June 26th, I'll be telling a story at Kevin Allison's show called Risk, and that is at the Pit. And I believe that's at 9 p.m., but check the Risk website.
And you have a website, don't you?
I do. It's christinegentry.net. And I try to post all of my shows on there as well. So.
And one last question. So is the fact of your show on Saturday, May 3rd, is that the lie?
Is that? No, because I gave you 3 and one of them was all 3 of those are true.
This is a trap. What am I doing?
It's a trap.
Help me, Spock. Cool. Okay, and do you have any? Okay, so there is going to be a listener, some boy or some girl, some timid teen, some timid boy, some professional working their office job, hanging out at the cubicle. The weight of the world is keeping them down. The man is keeping them down. And they have a story to tell. They have something they want to share with the world. What do you, Christine Gentry, professional storyteller, say to them?
2 things. Number 1, go to a Moth Story Slam. First, just to watch. Maybe 5 times just to watch. And then put your name into one. And then the other thing I would say is if you have one that's just a burning story that you really, really want to tell, the Moth has a pitch line. So if you go to themoth.org, there's a link there that has a phone number that you can call, and it has a machine that you record your pitch. And a lot of the main stage shows actually come from people calling in and pitching their stories.
Cool. So you've been listening to our good friend, Miss Christine Gentry, here on Ovation, the Performing Arts Show. My name is Dino, your friendly and delightful host.